When did a joke go way too far? Kesh vara tu mongala? Ryan said, pointing at the last slice of pizza. Nay, tu fara beleko, I said. Groma Stephen Esh. The guy at the next table stood up so fast his chair fell over. Where did you learn Proto-Sumerian? Learn what? I asked. That language you're speaking, he said, his hands actually shaking. It's been dead for 4,000 years. No, this is our own language. We made it up in high school, Ryan said. The guy pulled out his phone and called someone. David, get to Mario's Pizza right now. I found speakers. Yes, speakers. 3 of them. They're fluent. He hung up and sat at our table without asking. I'm Professor Mills from Columbia Linguistics. What you're speaking is a dialect that's been extinct since 2000 BC. No, it's not, I said, already getting that sick feeling when things are about to go sideways. We literally invented it in detention because we were bored. Say something else, Mills demanded. Please. Kesh Tanara Ula? Ryan said to me, which meant, is this guy crazy? Mills started crying. Actually crying in a pizza place at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday. Perfect. The pronunciation is perfect. A van pulled up, and 3 people ran in with recording equipment. They surrounded our table setting up microphones while Mills pointed at us like we were zoo animals. We need to document everything, a woman said. This is the discovery of the century. It's not a discovery, I said, getting annoyed now because our pizza was getting cold and these people were acting like we'd found Atlantis. Ryan came up with Kesh for what? Because it sounded funny. I did, Ryan confirmed. In Miss Sim Garcia's history class. Mills grabbed Ryan's shoulders. You must be the origin. Please, teach us Proto-Sumerian. I'm not anything, Ryan said, panicking. They came up with it with me. Ask them. We all started talking over each other, trying to explain that we just made this dumb language up one word at a time whenever we thought of a new funny sound. But no one would listen to us. They made us speak for 2 hours while they recorded everything. I kept waiting for someone to tell us we were being pranked, but everyone seemed deadly serious. Look, we have a notebook, Stephen said, pulling out the composition book where we'd written down our vocabulary. From high school. See? We made up grammar rules and everything. Mills looked at the notebook, and his eyes got wider with every page. This is impossible. You've recreated the exact grammatical structure. Even the conditional tenses we only theorized about. We made those up because they were funny, I said, remembering specifically how we'd decided that past conditional should have a stupid whistling sound in it just to make each other laugh in the hallway. Show me your conditional past, Mills said. Stephen said, and I could see the wheels turning in his head trying to remember what conditional even meant. Mora kesh tanu belekovara, he said, which meant, I would have been eating. Mills played a recording from his phone of some ancient clay tablet reconstruction. It sounded exactly like what Stephen had just said. My skin went cold, because that wasn't possible. We'd made that up. I was there. I remember Stephen suggesting the Vara ending while we were hiding behind the gym. This is a coincidence, Ryan said. It has to be. The next day, Mills brought Yale's Ancient Languages department head, then Harvard's, then someone from the British Museum. Our apartment was full of academics shouting about verb conjugations while we sat on our own couch like strangers in our home. They need to come to Oxford, the British guy said. They're coming to MIT first, another said. We'll pay. Pay? I said. The Smithsonian will give you each $50,000 to spend a month teaching our researchers, a woman said. To speak our made-up language? I said, though I was starting to doubt everything. Had we made it up? The notebook was real, our memories were real, but so was that recording. It's not made up, Mills insisted. One of you must have learned it somewhere. From who? Ryan said. Ancient Sumerians? We're from New Jersey. Mills pulled me aside. Did your grandmother ever sing to you in a strange language? Did you have dreams where people spoke differently? No, I said. We sat in detention making up funny sounds. But even as I said it, I was trying to remember if that was true. Had we made it up, or had it just come to us? When Ryan said Kesh that first time, had he invented it or remembered it? Then explain this, Mills said, showing me a tablet from 2000 BC. When he played the audio reconstruction, it was word for word the joke song Stephen had made up about Ryan's ex-girlfriend. That's impossible, I said, but something about those symbols seemed familiar, even though I'd never studied ancient languages. The entire song, Mills said, including the part about her unibrow of destiny. That's what these symbols mean. Stephen and Ryan were looking at the tablet now, too. We made that up junior year, Stephen said, in Ryan's basement. Did you? Mills asked. Or were you channeling ancient memories? We were high, Ryan said, not channeling anything. Mills's phone rang. When he came back, his face was pale. I need you 3 to come with me right now. Where? I asked. Someone needs to verify your identities, he said. Why? Stephen asked. Because the Venezuelan government is claiming you're spies using an ancient language as code, he said. And the State Department wants to know how 3 kids from Jersey learned a language that's been dead for 4 millennia. We looked at each other and said simultaneously, Groma hella dit, which meant, we're screwed. Mills herded us into the van before we could process what he'd just said about the State Department. I found myself sitting with recording equipment pointed at my face, and all I could think was that our pizza was definitely cold by now. Mills kept asking us to repeat phrases while his colleagues frantically typed notes on their laptops. One guy adjusted a microphone boom so close to my mouth I could smell the foam windscreen. A woman in a Columbia sweatshirt filmed everything on her phone, while another person scribbled in a notebook with actual paper and pen, like we were in some kind of archaeological dig. I realized this wasn't going to blow over like a normal Tuesday weirdness. This was something else entirely. Mills sat across from me, practically vibrating with excitement and asking us to say random things in our made-up language. Ryan leaned over and whispered to me in a voice so quiet I barely heard him. He said the phrase we used to mean is "this guy crazy," the one we'd made up specifically for talking about teachers behind their backs. Mills literally gasped, like Ryan had just recited Shakespeare. His hand flew to his chest, and his eyes got all wet and shiny. The woman with the microphone started crying too, actual tears running down her face, while she held the recording equipment steady. I got that sick feeling you get right before everything in your life changes forever. The kind of feeling I'd only had once before when my dad called to say my grandmother died. My stomach twisted and I wanted to throw up, but I just sat there frozen while these people treated our stupid detention joke like it was the most important thing they'd ever heard. I finally managed to interrupt and told them we needed to leave. Mills grabbed my arm and begged us to stay just 10 more minutes. His fingers dug into my forearm hard enough that I could feel them through my jacket. He promised it would be quick, just a few more phrases, just a little more documentation. Those 10 minutes turned into 2 hours of us speaking our dumb, made-up language while they recorded every sound. They made us conjugate verbs we'd invented as jokes. They asked us to describe objects in the van using our vocabulary. They wanted us to have a conversation about what we'd eaten for breakfast. Stephen kept checking his phone, and I could see him getting more stressed as time passed. Ryan looked like he wanted to punch someone. The whole time they treated us like we were archaeological artifacts instead of people trying to eat lunch. The woman filming kept asking us to repeat things slower, clearer, with more emotion. Mills pulled out a tablet and showed us symbols from ancient clay tablets and asked if they looked familiar, which they didn't, but he seemed disappointed every time we said no. When we finally escaped back to our apartment, Ryan immediately called his parents to tell them what happened. I could hear his mom freaking out through the phone from across the room, her voice getting higher and louder until Ryan had to hold the phone away from his ear. She kept asking if we were safe, if we needed a lawyer, if we'd been arrested. Stephen pulled out our old composition notebook from high school, where we'd written down all the vocabulary. The cover was bent and stained with what looked like old coffee rings. Inside, our handwriting from junior year looked so young and messy, full of crossed-out words and doodles in the margins. We started going through it trying to figure out how this was even possible. Page after page of words we'd made up, grammar rules we'd invented, conjugation charts we'd drawn. I remembered writing most of this stuff. I remembered the day Stephen suggested we needed a past perfect tense, and we'd spent an entire lunch period figuring out how it should sound. But looking at it now, with Mills's voice still in my head talking about Proto-Sumerian, I felt less certain about everything. The next morning I woke up to 17 missed calls, and my phone blowing up with texts from numbers I didn't recognize. Someone from Yale wanted to interview us. A professor from Berkeley offered to fly us to California. A guy from Oxford sent a 3-paragraph text about how we were the most important linguistic discovery in a century. Mills had apparently given out our contact information to every linguistics department on the East Coast, and now everyone wanted a piece of us. My phone kept buzzing with new messages, and I finally just turned it off because I couldn't handle it anymore. Ryan's phone was doing the same thing, and Stephen's too. We sat at our kitchen table with our dead phones in front of us, and nobody said anything for a while. The apartment felt too small suddenly, like the walls were closing in. Ryan suggested we just ignore all of it and pretend yesterday never happened. He said we could block everyone's numbers, delete our social media, and go back to being normal college students who nobody cared about. Stephen pointed out that Mills knew where we lived and probably wasn't going to leave us alone. He reminded us that the State Department wanted to talk to us, and you couldn't just ignore the State Department. We spent an hour arguing about what to do. Ryan thought we should hire a lawyer. Stephen thought we should talk to our professors at the school. I didn't know what I thought, except that I wanted to go back to Tuesday morning, when our biggest problem was splitting a pizza 3 ways. Finally, we decided we needed to at least figure out what Mills thought he'd discovered, because right now, We didn't even understand what we were dealing with. Mills showed up at our door at 9 in the morning without calling first. He brought 3 other professors and a bunch of printed articles about Proto-Sumerian. I was still in my pajamas when I answered the door, and there they were, Mills grinning like we were old friends, and 3 strangers carrying briefcases and laptop bags. They walked in without asking if it was okay. Mills spread everything across our coffee table like he owned the place. Papers covered the surface, some with ancient-looking symbols, others with dense academic text and footnotes. He started explaining how our language matched a dialect that died out 4,000 years ago. He pointed at charts and graphs and linguistic trees that meant nothing to me. The other professors nodded along like this all made perfect sense. One of them set up a laptop and pulled up what looked like a PowerPoint presentation about ancient Mesopotamia. I kept trying to explain that we made it up in Garcia's history class when we were bored. I told them about detention, about how we'd literally invented words one at a time because they sounded funny. Mills just smiled like I was a confused child who didn't understand what I was saying. He started talking about our subconscious accessing some kind of genetic memory, like we'd inherited the language through our DNA somehow. It sounded like complete nonsense, but he said it with such confidence that for a second I almost believed him. Ryan actually laughed in his face, which made the tension in the room even worse. The other professors looked uncomfortable, and one of them tried to change the subject by pulling out more papers. One of the other professors played a recording from a clay tablet reconstruction. The sound came out of his phone tinny and strange, but unmistakable. It sounded exactly like the conditional past tense we invented specifically because the whistling sound made us crack up in the hallway. My skin prickled with cold sweat, and I felt dizzy. I remembered Steven suggesting that ending while we were hiding behind the gym, remembered laughing so hard I couldn't breathe because it sounded so stupid. But now I was wondering if I really remembered it, or if I was just telling myself I did. Maybe we'd heard this recording somewhere. Maybe Miss Garcia had played it in class and we'd forgotten. The professor played it again, and it matched our language perfectly, every whistle and vowel sound in exactly the right place. Mills pulled out the composition notebook and started photographing every page while we were still processing what was happening. His phone camera clicked over and over. Steven tried to grab it back, but Mills insisted he needed to document everything. He held the notebook out of Steven's reach like a kid keeping a toy away from his little brother. Our private joke from high school was treated like it was as important as ancient scrolls found in a cave somewhere. Mills photographed the cover, the table of contents we'd made, every page of vocabulary, all our grammar rules, even the doodles and stupid jokes we'd written in the margins. The other professors crowded around to look at the photos on his phone screen. They pointed at specific words and argued about pronunciation and meaning. We just stood there in our own apartment watching strangers turn our teenage boredom into something we didn't recognize anymore. A woman from Yale with gray hair pulled back tight, stepped forward, and started asking questions about our families. She wanted to know if anyone at home spoke unusual languages, or if our grandparents came from anywhere exotic. I told her we were just regular kids from New Jersey, and all our grandparents spoke English. She looked disappointed like our boring family history was ruining some theory she had about genetic memory or ancient bloodlines. Ryan confirmed his family was from Jersey too, born and raised for 3 generations. Steven said his grandparents were from Pennsylvania and also spoke only English. The woman made notes, but her shoulders slumped, like we were letting her down by being normal. Mills kept trying to redirect to the language itself, but she was fixated on finding some mysterious origin story that didn't exist. Another professor suggested maybe we'd been exposed to recordings as children, but we all shook our heads. The apartment felt smaller with all these people in it, asking questions that had no interesting answers. Finally, after what felt like hours, they started packing up their recording equipment and papers. Mills made us promise not to speak to any other researchers until he could organize a proper study. We didn't promise anything, but nodded just to get them out. The door closed behind the last professor, and we sat there in stunned silence for about 20 minutes. Nobody spoke or moved. Ryan finally broke the quiet by saying we should call a lawyer. Steven immediately said that was overreacting, and we didn't need legal help for speaking a language we made up. But I was starting to agree with Ryan because this felt like it was spiraling into something we couldn't control anymore. Mills had mentioned the State Department and Venezuela and spies. Those weren't words that went with normal college life. Steven argued that lawyers cost money we didn't have, and what would we even tell them? Ryan said we could find someone who did free consultations at least. I sat between them feeling the weight of whatever this was becoming. My phone started buzzing, and I saw an unknown number from a Massachusetts area code. I answered, and a man introduced himself as calling from Harvard. He said they wanted to offer us $50,000 each to spend a month teaching their researchers our language. I felt my brain stutter trying to process that number. $50,000. I was sitting there thinking about my student loans that kept me awake at night and my rent that was due in a week. 50,000 sounded like a solution to every problem I had, but something about it felt wrong, like taking money for a magic trick after someone figured out how you did it. The Harvard guy was still talking about travel arrangements and stipends, and I realized I hadn't said anything for like 30 seconds. I told him we needed time to think about it. He said of course, and he'd email a contract over. We had 48 hours to decide. I hung up and told Ryan and Steven about the offer. Ryan's eyes got huge and he said we had to take it. Steven immediately pushed back, saying we didn't even know if what we were speaking was actually Proto-Sumerian or just some weird coincidence. Ryan said it didn't matter what it was if Harvard wanted to pay us. Steven said it absolutely mattered, because we'd be lying if we pretended to know something we didn't. They started arguing for real, with Ryan accusing Steven of overthinking everything like always. Steven fired back that Ryan just wanted to cash in on something we didn't understand. Their voices got louder, and I tried to interrupt, but they kept going. Ryan said Steven was being stupid about turning down $50,000. Steven said Ryan was being greedy and dishonest. I finally yelled that both of them needed to shut up. They stopped and looked at me. I said I was torn, because $50,000 would change my life, and part of me didn't care if it was real Proto-Sumerian or not. The Harvard guy had already emailed the contract, and I pulled it up on my phone. The terms looked official and intimidating with legal language I didn't totally understand. It said we had 48 hours to decide, which felt like pressure tactics, but also like an opportunity we'd be stupid to pass up. Steven started reading over my shoulder and pointing out clauses about intellectual property and exclusive rights. Ryan paced around the living room saying we were idiots if we didn't take this. My phone rang again, and I saw it was Mills. I answered, and his voice sounded different from before, worried. He said the State Department wanted to talk to us about how we learned the language. I asked why the State Department cared about a dead language. He got quiet for a second before saying something about international security concerns. Those words made my stomach drop. International security. I thanked him and hung up. Ryan's face went pale when I told him and Steven about the State Department call. Steven immediately pulled out his laptop and Googled Proto-Sumerian State Department. Nothing came up. No news articles or government websites or anything. Steven said that somehow made it worse because it meant this was serious enough that it wasn't public information yet. We spent the whole night trying to figure out what international security had to do with a language we made up in detention. Steven suggested maybe they thought we were using it as some kind of code. That sounded insane, until we remembered Mills mentioning Venezuela, claiming we were spies. Ryan said there was no way the actual government thought we were spies. But my hands were shaking, because governments made mistakes all the time, and we were three nobody college students with no resources to fight back if they decided we were suspicious. We stayed up until 3 in the morning Googling everything we could find about language-based espionage and government investigations. Most of it was conspiracy theory stuff, but some articles mentioned how intelligence agencies tracked unusual communication patterns. I barely slept, and when I did, I had dreams about being interrogated in a room with no windows. The next morning, my phone rang from another unknown number. A woman introduced herself as Gail Quinn. She said she was an attorney who specialized in cases involving government inquiries and academic disputes. Someone from MIT had recommended her after hearing about our situation. She offered a free consultation to explain what we were dealing with. I put her on speaker so Ryan and Steven could hear. We agreed to meet her that afternoon at a coffee shop near campus. Gail turned out to be maybe 40, with short dark hair and a briefcase that looked expensive. She shook our hands and ordered us all coffee before sitting down. She was immediately more reassuring than anyone else we'd talked to. She explained that the State Department probably just wanted to verify we weren't actually foreign agents using an ancient language as coded communication. She said it sounded ridiculous, but it was apparently a real concern they had to investigate. Gail asked if we'd been contacted by anyone from foreign governments, and we said no. She asked if we'd traveled internationally recently, and we said barely. She made notes and said this would probably be straightforward as long as we were honest about everything. The way she said it made it sound almost normal, like getting questioned by the government was just another Tuesday inconvenience. Gail pulled out a folder and slid it across the table. She told us not to sign anything from any university or research group without showing it to her first. The Harvard offer for $50,000 was real, she said, but we should ask for more since they clearly wanted us badly enough to throw money around. She also said we absolutely should not meet with the State Department without her sitting right there with us. Ryan leaned forward and asked how much her services would cost us. Gail said she'd work on contingency, meaning she'd take a percentage of whatever money we ended up making from this whole mess. Something about hearing that made it click in my head that this wasn't just weird anymore. This was actually a situation where we might make real money. Not just get harassed by professors and government agents, but actually profit from our dumb high school language. Stephen asked what percentage she meant, and Gail said 20% of anything we earned, which seemed fair since we had no idea what we were doing, and she clearly did. We shook hands, and Gail said she'd start reviewing the Harvard paperwork and reach out to the State Department to set up a meeting on our terms. That afternoon, we went back to Mario's Pizza, because we were trying to pretend life was normal, and we always got lunch there on Wednesdays. We were halfway through our first slices when a woman walked up to our table. She introduced herself as Jasmine Ellis from the local newspaper. She was probably in her late 20s with a notebook and a friendly smile that didn't seem fake. She asked if we'd be willing to talk to her about what it was like being at the center of an ancient language controversy. I immediately started to say no, because Gail had just told us not to talk to media. But Jasmine held up her hand and said she wasn't interested in the language itself, or whether it was real Proto-Sumerian. She said she was interested in how 3 regular guys were dealing with academics and government agents treating them like lab specimens instead of people. Something about the way she said it felt different from Mills and all his colleagues. Less like we were fascinating objects, and more like we were actual humans in a weird situation. Stephen suggested we should call Gail before agreeing to anything. Jasmine nodded and said that was smart. She pulled out a business card and set it on the table. Then she mentioned she'd found an old high school newsletter with a photo of the 3 of us in detention, the same year we supposedly invented the language. She said she was wondering if we wanted to tell our side of the story before someone else told a different version. That made my stomach twist, because I hadn't thought about other people controlling the narrative. Stephen picked up her card and said we'd call her after talking to our attorney. Jasmine thanked us and left without pushing, which made me think maybe she actually was different from the other reporters who'd been calling nonstop. We called Gail right from the pizza place. She answered on the second ring, and we explained about Jasmine and her approach. Gail was quiet for a minute, then said one carefully managed media interview might actually help us control the story. She offered to sit in on the interview and make sure we didn't say anything that could mess up the State Department situation. We agreed to meet with Jasmine the next day at Gail's office, where everything could stay professional and documented. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling and thinking about the conditional past tense. I kept trying to remember exactly how we came up with that whistling sound. The more I tried to pin down the specific memory, the fuzzier it got. I could see Stephen and Ryan and me standing behind the gym. I could feel the cold metal of the building against my back, but I couldn't remember who suggested the whistling or why it seemed funny. Part of me started wondering if Mills was right about subconscious influences, even though that sounded like complete nonsense. Maybe we had heard something somewhere and just forgot about it. But that didn't explain how we'd recreated an entire grammatical structure. I didn't fall asleep until almost 3 in the morning. Stephen woke me up by shoving his phone in my face. He'd found a Reddit thread about us with hundreds of comments. People were arguing about whether we were frauds trying to get famous, or geniuses who'd somehow channeled ancient knowledge. Someone had posted our address and phone numbers in the comments. Other people had added photos of our apartment building and our class schedules. The comments ranged from people calling us liars who deserved to be exposed, to people saying we were proof of reincarnation and past lives. Nobody in the thread seemed to consider that we might just be 3 confused guys who didn't understand what was happening. Ryan came out of his room and looked at the phone. He said we needed to call Gail immediately. Gail answered even though it was barely 8 in the morning. We told her about the doxing, and she said this was serious enough that we should think about staying somewhere else for a few days. She'd also gotten a formal request from the State Department for a meeting. She was working on negotiating the terms to make sure we weren't walking into some kind of interrogation room situation. She said she'd call us back in an hour after she talked to her contacts about the online harassment. Ryan's parents called 20 minutes later. They'd seen something online about the whole situation, and his mom was freaking out. They offered to let all 3 of us stay at their house until things calmed down. Ryan put them on speaker, and we could hear his mom saying the guest room had 2 beds, and Stephen could take the couch. But that felt like giving up, like admitting we couldn't handle our own lives. We talked it over after Ryan got off the phone. We decided to stay in our apartment but change our phone numbers and make all our social media accounts private. When Gail called back, we told her our plan. She said that was a reasonable compromise, as long as we stayed aware of our surroundings and didn't answer the door for anyone we didn't know. 2 days later, we drove to Gail's office for the interview with Jasmine. The office was in a boring building downtown with gray carpet and fluorescent lights that buzzed. Gail had a conference room set up with coffee and water bottles, which felt weirdly formal for just talking about our high school language. Jasmine showed up right on time carrying a notebook and a recorder, and she asked if it was okay to record before she even sat down. I liked that she asked, instead of just doing it like Mills had. We spent the first 20 minutes just going through the whole story from the beginning, starting with detention in Mr. Garcia's class. I explained how we were bored out of our minds, and Ryan just started making up sounds that he thought were funny. Requested Reds is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. Stephen added the part about how we'd write down new words in the composition notebook whenever we thought of something that made us laugh. Jasmine took notes, but she wasn't treating us like we were special or magical. She was just listening like a normal person hearing a weird story. It felt good to tell someone who didn't have an agenda about proving we were speaking ancient languages or channeling dead civilizations. When I got to the part about Mills crying in the pizza place, Jasmine actually smiled and said that sounded like Mills, which made me feel less crazy about the whole thing. Then Jasmine leaned forward and asked if we'd ever considered that maybe we were exposed to Proto-Sumerian somehow, without realizing it, like through a documentary or a podcast or something. My stomach dropped, because that was exactly what had been keeping me up at night for the past week. I admitted that I'd been trying to remember if we'd ever heard those sounds before we made up the language, but my memories felt fuzzy and unreliable now. Stephen suddenly sat up straighter and mentioned the AV room at our high school. He said Missy Garcia used to show documentaries all the time in her history class, and some of them were about ancient civilizations. Jasmine's whole face changed, and her eyes got this excited look, like Stephen had just handed her the missing piece of a puzzle. She asked what kind of documentaries, and if we remembered any specific ones about languages. Ryan and I looked at each other because neither of us could remember specific titles, but Stephen said there was definitely one about Mesopotamia that we watched junior year. Jasmine was writing fast now, and she asked if we thought we could find out what documentaries were available in our high school library back in the mid-2000s. I said maybe, if the school still had records, but I wasn't sure how that would help. Jasmine explained that if we'd been exposed to Proto-Sumerian reconstructions in a documentary, that could explain why our made-up language matched the ancient one so closely. We might have absorbed the sounds without consciously remembering them, and then recreated them later, thinking we were inventing something new. The idea made my skin crawl because it meant our memories were even less reliable than I thought, but it also made more sense than channeling ancient civilizations. After the interview ended, Jasmine packed up her recorder and said she was going to spend the next few days researching what documentaries about ancient languages were available in the mid-2000s. She promised she'd share whatever she found with us before she published anything, which surprised me, because I figured reporters just wrote whatever they wanted. Gail said that was unusually ethical for a journalist, and Jasmine shrugged and said she wasn't interested in making us look bad. She just wanted to figure out what actually happened. As we walked out to the parking lot, I felt lighter than I had in days. Talking to Jasmine had been therapeutic in a way I hadn't expected. Like finally someone believed we were just regular people caught up in something weird, instead of con artists or savants. Ryan said he felt the same way, and Stephen was already Googling how to contact our old high school's library. The next week was all about preparing for the State Department meeting. Gail called us in for 2 separate prep sessions where she went through every possible question they might ask. She said they'd probably want to know about our families, our travel history, anyone we knew from Venezuela or other foreign countries, and any exposure we'd had to foreign languages or cultures. I kept thinking it was overkill because we were just 3 guys from New Jersey who'd never been anywhere, but Gail insisted we needed to have clear, consistent answers ready. She made us practice responding to questions without getting defensive or sarcastic, which was harder than it sounds because the whole situation felt ridiculous. Ryan kept wanting to joke about it, but Gail shut that down fast and said the State Department wouldn't find spy accusations funny even if they were obviously false. Stephen was the most nervous about the meeting, and he kept asking what would happen if they didn't believe us. Gail repeated multiple times that we weren't under investigation and this was just documentation, but I could tell Stephen wasn't convinced. The morning of the State Department meeting, I woke up with my stomach in knots. We all met at Gail's office and drove together to a government building that looked like every boring federal office in movies. Security made us go through metal detectors and sign in, and then we waited in a bland conference room for 20 minutes. When Luis Mercier finally walked in, I was surprised because he was way younger than I expected, maybe early 30s, and he was wearing a regular suit instead of whatever intimidating outfit I'd imagined State Department people wore. He shook all our hands and sat down across from us, and the first thing he said was that we weren't under investigation and he just needed to document our background for their files. His voice was calm and professional, and somehow that made me feel better than anything Gail had said during prep. The meeting turned out to be mostly boring questions that we'd already practiced answering. Luis asked where we'd traveled, and I said barely anywhere except one family trip to Florida when I was 12. He asked who we knew internationally, and Ryan said nobody, unless you counted his cousin who studied abroad in Spain for a semester. He asked how we learned the language, and we all explained the detention story again, which was starting to feel rehearsed from how many times we'd told it. Luis took notes on a laptop and occasionally asked follow-up questions, but nothing felt accusatory or suspicious. He asked about our families' backgrounds, and we explained that we were all just regular American families with no interesting foreign connections. When Luis asked if we'd ever been contacted by foreign nationals about the language, I almost laughed because the only foreign national who'd shown any interest in us was apparently the Venezuelan government, who thought we were spies. I said that out loud before I could stop myself, and Luis didn't smile. He made a note on his laptop that looked more serious than the other notes, and I felt Gail's foot tap mine under the table like a warning. Gail interrupted and asked what the actual concern was here, and Luis stopped typing to look at us directly. He explained that the Venezuelan government had filed a formal claim that we were using Proto-Sumerian as a cipher for coded communications. He said it was almost certainly paranoid nonsense because there was no evidence of us communicating with anyone in Venezuela or having any connection to Venezuelan affairs, but the claim had been filed through official channels, so they had to document everything to close the file properly. Stephen asked what happens if we can't prove we're not spies, and for the first time, Luis actually smiled. He said that's not how it works, because you can't prove a negative. He explained that they just needed to document our exposure history and the origin of the language, and then the file would get closed unless new evidence emerged that suggested actual espionage activity. Since we clearly had no connection to Venezuela and no history of suspicious behavior, he expected the file to close within a few weeks once he finished his paperwork. After the meeting ended and Luis walked us back to the lobby, Gail said it went as well as she could have hoped. She expected the State Department to leave us alone now that they had everything documented. Then she brought up the Harvard offer and said they'd been calling her office asking for our decision. She explained that we needed to make a choice soon because Harvard was getting impatient and might withdraw the offer if we waited much longer. Ryan wanted to talk about it right there in the parking lot, but Gail said we should go home and discuss it as a group without her present. As we drove back to our apartment, I kept thinking about $50,000 and what it could do for my life, but I also kept thinking about Jasmine's question about documentary exposure and whether we really knew where our language came from. That evening, back at the apartment, Ryan pulled out his laptop and opened the Harvard email, while Stephen and I sat on the couch, staring at our phones, trying to process everything from the State Department meeting. Ryan turned the screen toward us and pointed at the $50,000 figure. He said we'd be idiots to walk away from this kind of money just because we weren't totally sure where the language came from. Stephen closed his laptop and said, taking money for something we might have stolen from some documentary or book felt wrong even if we didn't remember doing it. Ryan's face got red, and he asked if Stephen really thought we plagiarized an entire language without knowing it. Stephen said he didn't know what to think anymore, but handing over our made-up grammar to Harvard for cash when we couldn't even explain how it matched ancient recordings felt dishonest. I interrupted before they could start actually yelling and pointed out that we didn't copy anything on purpose. If academics wanted to pay us for teaching them the language we'd been speaking for years, that was their choice to make. We spent 2 hours going back and forth about it, with Ryan pulling up his student loan balance and Stephen talking about academic integrity, until I finally suggested we compromise. We'd tell Harvard yes, but negotiate for $60,000 each, like Gail had mentioned, and we'd be completely honest about not knowing where all the language elements came from. Ryan and Stephen both agreed to that, and Ryan started drafting an email response while I made coffee because my head hurt from thinking in circles about memory and invention. The next morning, Jasmine called while I was still in bed, and her voice sounded different, more urgent than usual. She said she'd found something and needed to tell us right away. My stomach dropped before she even explained, because that tone meant whatever she'd discovered was going to change things. She told us about a cable documentary from the 2000s called Lost Voices of Mesopotamia that had been available on DVD in the school libraries across the state. It included a whole segment on Proto-Sumerian with audio reconstructions of how linguists thought the language sounded. She said the documentary had been in circulation during our high school years, and Mrs. Garcia's name appeared on borrowing records from multiple schools in the district. I sat up in bed, and my hands started shaking because I knew exactly what this meant even before she finished explaining. We'd heard this documentary in class and forgotten about it completely. Ryan and Stephen were both awake by the time I got off the phone, and I told them what Jasmine had found. Stephen grabbed his keys before I even finished talking and said we needed to go to the high school right now to check the AV room archives. We drove there in Stephen's car without eating breakfast, and the whole way Ryan kept saying maybe we'd remember watching the documentary once we saw it. The school looked smaller than I remembered, and the front office lady seemed confused about why 3 college kids wanted to search through old DVDs, but she called down to the AV room and told us someone would help. The current AV teacher was younger than Mr. Garcia had been, and he looked puzzled when we explained we were trying to find a specific documentary from our time as students. He led us to a storage room filled with cardboard boxes labeled by year and subject and said, "Miss Garcia had checked out dozens of documentaries over the years for her history classes." Stephen started going through the boxes methodically, while Ryan and I pulled out DVDs and read their labels. The first box had nothing about ancient languages, just World War II documentaries and civil rights movement materials. The second box was all about medieval Europe and the Crusades. Stephen opened the third box and went very still before pulling out a DVD case with a faded cover showing clay tablets and ancient writing. He held it up, and I could see the title Lost Voices of Mesopotamia printed across the top. His hands were shaking as he opened the case and found the library checkout card still tucked inside. Mrs. Garcia's signature appeared 4 times during the years we'd been in her class, along with dates that matched our sophomore and junior years. I asked the AV teacher if we could watch it, and my voice came out weird and tight. He set us up in an empty classroom with an old DVD player and TV on a rolling cart. We sat in student desks that felt too small now, and Stephen put the disc in while Ryan and I stared at the blank screen. The documentary started with dramatic music and sweeping shots of desert ruins. A narrator with a deep voice talked about lost civilizations and forgotten languages, while showing clay tablets covered in wedge-shaped marks. 20 minutes in the segment on Proto-Sumerian began, and a linguist appeared on screen explaining how scholars had reconstructed the sounds of this dead language. Then the audio started playing, and I felt my whole body go cold. The reconstructed Proto-Sumerian coming through the TV speakers had that same whistling sound in the conditional past tense that we'd invented behind the gym. The exact same sound that had made us laugh so hard we couldn't breathe. We sat there not moving or talking as the documentary continued. More reconstructed phrases emerged from the speakers, and the cadence matched our language, even though the specific words were different. The phonetic patterns were unmistakably similar to what we'd been speaking for years. The way certain syllables connected, the rhythm of the sentences, even some of the vowel sounds felt familiar in a way that made my skin crawl. Stephen grabbed the remote and paused it. He said we must have heard this in class and absorbed it without realizing, and then forgotten we'd ever watched it. I stared at the frozen image of the linguist on screen and tried to remember sitting in Miss Garcia's classroom watching this exact documentary, but I had zero memory of it. Ryan asked how we could forget something that influenced us this much. Stephen said memory doesn't work the way we think it does, and sometimes we absorb things subconsciously, without any conscious recollection of the source. Ryan stood up and started pacing between the desks. His face was pale, and he kept running his hands through his hair. He said this meant we didn't actually invent anything. We just copied sounds from a documentary and fooled ourselves into thinking we'd created them. I pointed out that we definitely added our own words and grammar rules, because the documentary didn't include vocabulary for things like Ryan's ex-girlfriend's unibrow. Stephen nodded and said we'd clearly built our own language on top of the phonetic foundation we'd absorbed, but the core sound patterns came from this documentary. Ryan asked what we were supposed to tell Harvard now. I said we tell them the truth, that we found the likely source of our phonetic patterns, and we'd unconsciously incorporated them into our constructed language. Stephen ejected the DVD and we drove straight to Gail's office without calling first. Her assistant said she was with another client, but Gail came out when she heard we were there and saw our faces. We went into her conference room and Stephen put the DVD in her laptop. She watched the relevant segments with her lawyer face on, taking notes and occasionally pausing to replay certain parts. When it finished, she closed the laptop and said this was actually good news. It proved we weren't spies or linguistic savants or people channeling ancient memories. We were just students who'd been exposed to scholarly reconstructions in a high school history class and had unconsciously incorporated those patterns into a language we'd built for fun. She said this gave us a clear, documented source for the phonetic similarities that had everyone so excited. Gail picked up her phone and called Luis while we sat there feeling drained. She explained about finding the documentary and how Missy Garcia had checked it out multiple times during our high school years. She told him the DVD was available in the school libraries across the state, and the reconstructed audio matched the patterns in our language. Luis said something we couldn't hear, and Gail smiled. She told us he sounded relieved and said, "This should be enough to close the State Department file." He'd need to document the specific documentary and its availability during our high school years, but this explained the whole situation without requiring any investigation into espionage or foreign contacts. Gail hung up and said we were officially no longer interesting to the government. The Venezuelan spy theory was dead, and we could go back to being regular college students who happened to make up a language based on half-remembered sounds from a documentary we'd watched in detention. That evening, my phone rang while I was making dinner. Mills's number showed up, and I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. His voice sounded strained when he started talking about the documentary. He insisted the reconstructions in that film were speculative garbage made by pop science producers who didn't understand real linguistic methodology. He said our language showed accuracy that went beyond anything in that documentary. I could hear papers rustling in the background like he was searching through notes while talking to me. He kept saying the documentary producers had guessed at phonetic patterns, but we had somehow captured the authentic sounds that scholars had only theorized about. I told him we'd literally watched that documentary in high school and absorbed the sounds without realizing it. He went quiet for a long time before saying he needed to review his data again. When he hung up, I knew his big discovery was falling apart, and part of me felt bad for him, even though this whole mess was his fault. The next morning, an email arrived from someone named Minerva Dougherty. She introduced herself as a linguist who specialized in ancient languages and said she'd been arguing with Mills for days about his Proto-Sumerian claims. She'd heard about the documentary and wanted to run some tests comparing our language to both the documentary audio and current scholarship. She said the tests would be blind, so we wouldn't know what we were being compared against. She promised the results would be published regardless of what they showed. Something about her straightforward approach made me trust her more than Mills. I forwarded the email to Ryan and Stephen, and we agreed to participate. Minerva scheduled us for 2 days at MIT the following week. The testing happened in a small lab with recording equipment and computers. Minerva had us speak phrases in our language while cameras captured everything. Then she gave us written phrases in English and had us translate them without any context about what she was testing. She recorded us transcribing sounds she played and asked us to explain our grammar rules. The whole process felt clinical and scientific in a way that Mills's excited documentation never had. On the second day, she had us work separately, so we couldn't influence each other's answers. I sat in a booth translating phrases and realized how much of our language really did follow English sentence structure. When Minerva called us back 3 days later, she sounded gentle but firm. The results showed our grammatical structure mirrored modern English way more than Proto-Sumerian. Our vocabulary included constructions that wouldn't exist in an ancient language. She explained this carefully, like she didn't want to embarrass us. She said we'd created something remarkable, but it wasn't Proto-Sumerian. Honestly, it felt like a relief. The weight of possibly channeling ancient memories or being part of some linguistic mystery lifted off my shoulders. We were just college students who'd made up a language based on sounds we'd heard in a documentary. That was weird enough without adding ancient civilizations to the mix. Mills sent an email 2 days after the results came out. The message was long and rambling. He said we were still remarkable for creating a functional language with consistent grammar. He admitted he may have gotten overly enthusiastic about the Proto-Sumerian connection. He said his initial reconstructions might have been influenced by his desire to make a major discovery. The email never quite became a real apology, but it was close enough. I wrote back saying I understood how easy it was to see patterns that weren't really there. The Harvard offer disappeared without any formal notification. One day the contact person just stopped returning Gail's emails. She said that was typical for academic institutions when research didn't pan out. The money would have changed everything, but I understood why they withdrew. Gail negotiated with the Smithsonian instead. They agreed to pay us for all the time we'd spent being documented and tested. We each got $15,000, which wasn't the $50,000 we'd been promised, but it wasn't nothing either. I paid off 2 credit cards and my car loan. Ryan covered 3 months of rent in advance. Stephen bought a new laptop and put the rest toward tuition. Luis sent an official letter on State Department letterhead. The letter confirmed we weren't under any suspicion, and the file was closed. He included a separate note saying our case would be used as a training example about how internet rumors could spiral into international concerns. He thanked us for our cooperation and said the documentary discovery had resolved everything cleanly. I filed the letter in a folder and tried not to think about how close we'd come to being investigated as foreign agents. The Venezuelan government never officially took back their spy claim. Grant Pate stopped calling and emailing. The whole thing just faded away like it had never happened. Gail said that was normal for diplomatic situations. Nobody wanted to admit they'd been wrong, so they just quietly moved on to other concerns. She said the lack of formal retraction meant they probably realized their mistake, but couldn't lose face by acknowledging it publicly. Jasmine's article came out in the local paper and got picked up by a few online news sites. She explained the whole documentary connection and interviewed Minerva about how linguistic memory worked. She included quotes from us about how strange it felt to discover we hadn't invented something we were completely sure we'd created. The article was fair and didn't make us look stupid. She focused on the psychology of memory and creativity rather than treating us like frauds or fools. Reading it made me realize how easily our brains had rewritten our memories to make us feel like originators instead of unconscious imitators. The online harassment shifted after Jasmine's article. People stopped doxing us and sending threats. Instead, they made memes about us being fake ancient language bros. Someone created an image macro of the three of us with text saying we'd discovered Proto-Sumerian at the mall. Another meme showed our faces photoshopped onto ancient Sumerian statues with captions about channeling spirits from detention. Ryan started laughing at some of them, which helped diffuse the tension. He sent me one showing us as ancient priests, with the caption about inventing history in Mrs. Garcia's class. The mockery stung less than the threats. At least people had moved on from thinking we were dangerous spies or linguistic savants. We were just three guys who'd fooled some professors and ourselves about making up a language. I could live with being a meme if it meant the scary part was over. A week after Jasmine's article came out, Ryan suggested we go back to Mario's Pizza. Stephen and I agreed because we needed to reclaim that space and stop letting it feel like the place where everything went wrong. We walked in on a Thursday afternoon, and the same guy was working behind the counter, the one who'd watched Mills cry into our table that first day. He nodded at us like we were regular customers and asked what we wanted. We ordered a large pepperoni and sat at our usual table near the window. The pizza came out hot, and nobody stared at us or pulled out recording equipment. The guy at the next table was just scrolling his phone and eating breadsticks. He didn't care about Proto-Sumerian or ancient languages or anything except his lunch. Ryan took a bite and said, "This was the first time in 3 weeks that pizza tasted normal." Stephen agreed, and we sat there eating like regular people instead of specimens being studied. The relief felt physical, like I could finally unclench muscles I didn't know I'd been tensing. When we finished, we paid and left, and nobody stopped us or asked questions or tried to document anything. Outside on the sidewalk, Stephen said we should probably finish documenting our language properly, not for academics, but just for ourselves. Ryan asked what he meant, and Stephen explained that we had this notebook full of vocabulary and grammar rules, but we'd never actually organized it or figured out what parts we definitely invented versus what we might have absorbed from that documentary. I said that sounded like a good weekend project, and we agreed to do it. Back at the apartment, we pulled out the composition notebook and spread it across the coffee table, along with the Lost Voices DVD and a laptop. Stephen suggested we go through page by page and add notes about our memories of creating each word or rule. We spent Saturday and Sunday doing exactly that, playing sections of the documentary and comparing them to our notebook entries. Some words we could definitely trace to the documentary, like the basic greetings and numbers. Other words we were certain we'd invented, like the slang terms we'd made up for teachers we didn't like. The grammar rules were harder to pin down because the documentary only covered basics, and we'd built this whole complicated system of tenses and conditionals. Stephen noted which rules matched the documentary's reconstructions, and which ones seemed to be our own additions influenced by English and Spanish grammar. Ryan found it weird to see our high school invention laid out like this, half absorbed and half created. I admitted it made me feel less special, but also less confused about where it all came from. By Sunday evening, we had a fully annotated notebook that showed the mix of sources, and Stephen said we should keep this for ourselves as a record of what actually happened. Ryan suggested we could make a podcast about the whole experience, walk people through how we accidentally fooled linguistics professors with a language we thought we'd invented. Stephen and I immediately said no. Ryan looked disappointed, but I explained that we were done being public figures, and I just wanted to be a regular student again. Stephen agreed and said he was tired of people treating us like curiosities or frauds or anything other than three guys who made a mistake. Ryan admitted he understood and said he was probably just thinking about the podcast because he felt sidelined during the whole thing. I told him we'd all been sidelined by academics who didn't care what we actually thought or felt. Stephen said the best thing we could do now was step back and let it all fade away. We agreed that we were done with interviews and attention and being the language guys. The next day, I called Gail and asked if she could help us draft a statement for social media. She said that was smart and came over that afternoon with her laptop. We worked together to write something clear and direct that explained the documentary connection without being defensive or apologetic. The statement said we'd discovered we'd been exposed to Proto-Sumerian reconstructions in high school and had unconsciously incorporated them into a language we thought we'd invented from scratch. We explained that we weren't linguistics experts or ancient language speakers, just students who'd made an honest mistake about the origins of our own creation, We made it clear we weren't doing any more interviews. We weren't teaching the language to anyone, and we weren't interested in any more attention or opportunities related to this situation. Gail helped us strike the right tone, factual but firm about our boundaries. We posted the statement on all our social media accounts and then made everything private except that one post. Within hours, we started getting responses, most of them supportive or at least understanding. A few people still called us frauds, but the majority seemed to accept our explanation and move on. Gail said this was the best outcome we could hope for, a clear public statement that gave people closure without feeding the controversy. She suggested we ignore any further media requests and just let the story die naturally. We agreed and thanked her for everything she'd done to protect us during this mess. A week after we posted the statement, I got an email from Mills. The subject line said apology, and I almost deleted it without reading. But something made me open it, and I found a genuine, thoughtful message that surprised me. Mills wrote that he'd let his excitement override his scientific skepticism, and he'd treated us like discoveries instead of people. He admitted he'd gotten caught up in the possibility of finding living speakers of a dead language, and had ignored all the evidence that contradicted his theory. He said he was taking a sabbatical from Columbia to reevaluate his research methods and think about how his enthusiasm had hurt us. The email ended with a sincere apology for the disruption and stress he'd caused our lives. I read it twice, and then showed it to Ryan and Stephen. Ryan said it was too little too late, but Stephen said it took courage to admit you'd been wrong like that. I decided to write back and said I appreciated the apology and hoped his sabbatical helped him find better balance between excitement and skepticism. I didn't say we forgave him because I wasn't sure I did, but I acknowledged his effort to make amends. 2 days later, Minerva emailed asking if we'd be willing to guest lecture in her linguistics class about our experience. She said she wanted to focus on how easy it is to fool yourself about the origins of your own ideas and how memory can be unreliable even when it feels certain. She promised it wouldn't be exploitative and we'd have full control over what we shared. Stephen thought it sounded like a constructive way to close this chapter. Ryan agreed it might help other students avoid making similar mistakes. I said yes, as long as Minerva kept her promise about it not being exploitative. She confirmed, and we scheduled the lecture for the following week. The guest lecture happened in a small classroom with about 30 students. Minerva introduced us and explained the basic situation without sensationalizing it. Then we told our story, walking through how we'd created the language in detention, how Mills had discovered us at Mario's Pizza, how the whole thing had spiraled into international attention, and how we'd finally traced our language back to a documentary we'd forgotten watching. The students asked thoughtful questions about memory and creativity and how to distinguish between invention and absorption. One student asked how we felt about discovering we hadn't invented something we were so sure we'd created. I said it was disorienting but ultimately less scary than thinking we'd somehow channeled an ancient language. Another student asked if we still used the language, and Stephen admitted we sometimes caught ourselves speaking it without thinking. The best moment came when a student said our story made her realize she needed to be more careful about citing sources and checking where her ideas actually came from. That made the whole mess feel worthwhile, like maybe our mistake could help someone else avoid the same trap. After the lecture, Minerva thanked us, and several students came up to say they appreciated our honesty. Walking back to our apartment, Ryan said that felt like closure. Stephen agreed, and I realized he was right. 3 weeks after everything started, we were sitting in our apartment eating pizza and watching TV like normal people. Some reality show was playing and we were barely paying attention, just enjoying the mindless entertainment after weeks of stress. Stephen mentioned that he sometimes caught himself starting to speak our made-up language and had to consciously switch back to English. Ryan laughed and said he did the same thing, especially when he was tired or not thinking about it. I admitted I'd done it twice that week, once at the grocery store and once in class. We agreed it was weird how the language had become automatic, even though we'd only used it as a joke for years. Stephen said it proved how easily our brains absorb and reproduce patterns without conscious effort. Ryan said it also proved we'd actually created something functional, even if it wasn't entirely original. That led to a conversation about what we should do with the language going forward. We made a pact that if we were going to keep using it, we'd only do it intentionally, and we'd acknowledge it was a constructed language, influenced by a documentary we'd seen in high school. We agreed the mystery of exactly how much we'd invented versus absorbed probably wouldn't ever be completely solved, and we were okay with that ambiguity now. Stephen said maybe not knowing everything was better than the false certainty we'd had before. Ryan said he just wanted to be the guys who accidentally fooled some professors, instead of the guys who were still trying to figure it all out. I agreed, and said life was going back to normal, or at least our new normal, where we had this weird story that would probably follow us forever, but didn't define us anymore. We finished our pizza and went back to watching TV, three regular students with an unusual past, but an ordinary present. And that's today's story. I'm honestly just happy you were here to hear it, because it makes every word mean a little more. I hope it left you smiling or at least a bit lighter. Subscribe if you'd like to stick around for more.